fortunes of Ghanaians with each so-called big push. This is heartbreaking. This 1 percentage point gap, nearly $1.1 billion in foregone public investment, was not a product of efficiency savings. It reflected cash rationing, auction shortfalls, and mounting debt service pressures in levels. In reality, the minister's approach to fiscal management is not disciplined, it is reactive, relying on short-term cuts to maintain the appearance of order. And this is very dangerous for our medium to long-term development. Using Ghana's macroeconomic parameters and IMF consistent multipliers, you will clearly understand the cost of the damage the minister is causing the economy. Effective demand cut of about 0.514% of GDP. That's quite colossal. GDP impact, the fall in GDP, about 0.41% of GDP, equivalent to $469 million. Revenue loss, about $75 million. Foregone potential growth, about 0.1 percentage point annually. And so, by underspending the capital budget approved for 2025, 1.5% of GDP, while the minister has done 0.5% of GDP, this is the cost to the economy. The government has effectively traded tomorrow's output for today's optics. Every 1 percentage point cut in public investment means thousands of construction and supply chain jobs not created, roads and schools not completed, and private contractors pushed into arrears. Short-term fiscal savings thus translate into higher unemployment, weaker SMEs, and slower future tax growth. Real GDP grew by 6.3% year-on-year in the first half of 2025, yet the composition of this growth is telling. The recent 6.3% growth is services heavy, led by ICT, finance, and trade, while construction and manufacturing lag. The government is not building the economy's productive base. Banks, meanwhile, are crowded out by government borrowing at the short end, preferring T-bills over long-term lending, deepening the cycle of high interest, low investment, and low job creation. Since this administration came into office, the budgets that they have presented to this House, to Parliament, 2025 budget and the mid-year budget, allocations for capital expenditure and goods and services remain unreleased, and workers across the public sector are paid but not given the necessary tools and inputs to work. This is what we call fiscal indiscipline, that you pay workers and yet you don't release goods and services to give them the tools and the inputs to work with. That is fiscal indiscipline in reality. Some ministries do not even have basic things, such as toilet rolls, and are unable to even provide fuel for government work. A close look at the data presented in the 2026 budget confirmed the fear by the minority early this year that this government was incapable of implementing its programs they presented in the 2025 budget. For example, goods and services. The government programmed to spend 5.1 billion Ghana cedis from Q1 to Q3, but ended up spending only 3.8 billion Ghana cedis. This compares to the annual allocation of 6.7 billion Ghana cedis. The amount released for goods and services is about 56% of the total allocation for the year, yet the year has come to an end already. CAPEX. The program CAPEX for Q1 to Q3 was 26.6 billion Ghana cedis, but actual release was just 11 billion Ghana cedis. This is 34% of the total CAPEX of 32.6 billion Ghana cedis allocated for the year 2025. So when we say the minister has not been spending, we are right. the minister's own data on the release for goods and services and capital spending say it all. The more concerning from these developments is the systematic and deliberate under-execution of growth-enhancing public investment. The under-execution of capital projects is also a mirror of fiscal fragility, including revenue pressures, because persistent shortfalls have eroded space for discretionary spending, financing constraints, because frequent auction under subscription have forced reliance on short-term T-bills, raising rollover risk, and rising interest costs, because a growing share of revenue is locked into debt service, crowding out the growth expenditure. By cutting investment to meet short-term cash targets, the government is treating liquidity symptoms rather than addressing structural weaknesses in revenue and debt management. Public investment has one of the highest employment multipliers in Ghana's economy. Construction and engineering absorb large numbers of semi-skilled workers and drive demand for cement, steel, and transport services. When capital projects stall, contractors' arrears accumulate, SME liquidity tightens, and bank non-performing loans creep upward. The short-term fiscal saving thus creates medium-term job and credit losses. The government has effectively chosen accounting aesthetics over economic substance, with a finance minister who has weaponized underspending as a tool of false prudence. By systematically failing to release funds for approved projects, the minister is creating artificial savings that marks his inability to mobilize revenue or manage debt sustainably. This is not fiscal discipline, it is fiscal deception. Is it not curious that the might talked about Nkoko Nkitinkiti was just launched this week, in spite of the fact that the 2025 budget provision for it since March 2025, a clear example of how this government is struggling to implement its priority programs. And let me use this opportunity to caution that the Harmattan season has just started in some parts of the country. And we don't want to hear stories later that the chicks have been killed by the Harmattan. Timing is of utmost importance when you are implementing a program. Also, ladies and gentlemen, the National Codex program, which was not implemented, has found yet another space in the 2026 budget, with an equivalent 100 million Ghana cedis allocated to it, similar to what they did last year and could not implement. Road contractors, businesses, and other providers of government services are suffering from this minister's self-created liquidity drought, while his officials celebrate restraint. In time, the actual impact of the policies employed during this minister's honeymoon period will hit all of us. The current administration secured the mandate of Ghanaians on the back of lofty pledges to transform the economic paradigm of our beloved nation. Yet, unfortunately, those promises have not materialized. You remember the 24-hour economy, which the government launched this year. This program was said to be a job creation policy with a homegrown formula. They told us 1-3-3, 1 job, 3 people, 3 shifts. But what has happened so far? Today, the 24-hour economy policy is a confusing mix of policy ideas with no clear implementation arrangements. The same youth who were told they would have shifts to work once this government comes to power continue to roam the streets without work, while farmers and traders complain of poor sales due to weak demand. The 24-hour economy program is estimated to cost $4 billion, of which the government is expected to contribute between $300 to $400 million. We are going into the second year since the program was launched, yet the government failed to announce in the 2026 budget the targeted tax incentives and rebates it promised to attract the investment. The allocation of 90 million Ghana cedis to the 24-hour economy for 2026 In fact, the minister said 110 million Ghana cedis for 2026. But if you go to the appendix, you will see only 90 million Ghana cedis allocated towards the 24-hour economy. Deception. 70 million of this is for goods and services, and 20 million of this is for capex. This can best be described as tokenism, given that the program is the main development blueprint of the NDC government. This, no doubt, is helpless. This cannot help achieve the program objectives of creating a 133 job model. On another note, the big push, which was promised 13 billion Ghana cedis for implementation by the government for 2025 fiscal year, had by July been issued commitment authorization of only 7.6 billion Ghana cedis. You allocate 13 billion Ghana cedis. You issue commitment authorization covering only 7.6 billion Ghana cedis. It is yet to be seen how much they have actually disbursed under the program as the year draws to the end. Will Ghanaians therefore believe the President and the Minister for Finance for allocating 30 billion Ghana cedis for big push in the 2026 budget, when they could not even release funds allocated for the same big push in the 2025 budget? Surprisingly, in his usual excitement, the minister indicated at paragraph 1183 of the budget statement, and I quote, "The 63 billion Ghana cedi road contracts awarded so far under the big push would generate an estimated 490,000 jobs." Unquote. I take it again. At paragraph 1183 of the budget statement, the minister said, and I quote, "The 63 billion Ghana cedi road contracts awarded so far under the big push, 63 billion Ghana cedis of contracts, road contracts awarded so far under the big push would generate an estimated 490,000 jobs." Another deception. How is the government able to award road contracts under the big push amounting to 63 billion Ghana cedis when the total allocation for 2025 was just 13 billion Ghana cedis? These 490,000 jobs promised from the big push are dead on arrival, as there are no contracts worth 63 billion Ghana cedis under the big push anywhere in Ghana. Even if you were to add the total allocation for the 2025 and 2026 budget for the big push, it will amount to 43 billion Ghana cedis, far less than the 63 billion Ghana cedis stated by the minister as having been awarded already. This is how this government is manufacturing success stories for itself. Even if this is true, then it will mean that the Honorable Minister for Finance would have violated the Public Financial Management Act, which frowns on awarding contracts without budget allocation or commitment authorization. The promised big push for jobs, ladies and gentlemen, which they are also saying will provide infrastructure, is therefore not reflected in the numbers. Despite the strong rhetoric, capital expenditure in the budget for 2026 is only 3.6% of GDP, far below what is required for a genuine infrastructure-led transformation. At the same time, they are proposing 5.7% of GDP for wages, 3.6% of GDP for interest payments, about 4% of GDP for statutory transfers. These rigid items consume more than 2/3 of total spending, leaving very limited room for transformative investments. In reality, this 2026 budget is not investment-driven and marks serious challenges. It also shows that there is no structural shift, as the composition of the budget remains the same. We urge Ghanaians to seriously manage expectations, as we are in for another year of inactivity and disappointment. The high domestic borrowing will crowd out credit to the private sector. The overall deficit on cash basis is proposed to be 4% of GDP, and the government plans to borrow 4.4% of GDP from the domestic market. With banks already heavily exposed to government securities, increased domestic borrowing will reduce access to credit for SMEs, maintain high domestic interest, and undermine job creation and private sector expansion. This contradicts the stated ambition of a jobs and export-focused recovery. The capital spending cuts also produce a superficial improvement in the current account. Direct import compression is estimated at 0.13% of GDP. Income-induced import fall is estimated at 0.12% of GDP. Total current account gain, about 0.25% of GDP, amounting to $287 million. But this is not a sign of external strength. It is demand suppression. A healthier balance would arise from export expansion, not from stalled construction and idle capital budgets. There is also the case of the gold board. In the 2025 budget, the government allocated $279 million to gold board to purchase gold. Till date, members of the press, this amount has not been disbursed. Rather, the Bank of Ghana has been pre-financing gold board's purchases of gold, including purchases of gold from Galamsey operators. Wow. Oh. The Bank of Ghana must come clear how much money it has printed to finance gold board. This is important because it amounts to central bank financing of the government, a practice frowned upon by Ghana's program with the IMF. The IMF must also speak up rather than sleeping while this government is violating fundamental principles underlying the program. The government's own inability to properly implement any policies beyond short-term cost-cutting has created a paradox. Headline figures that appear respectable on paper, but an economy that feels stagnant and lifeless to ordinary citizens. The economy this government wants us to celebrate is a ticking time bomb that has let down the many young people who were promised jobs, let down the entrepreneurs who were promised opportunities, and let down the nation that was promised transformation. What we have is an economy stuck in low productivity, weak investment, and broken promises, with a minister who has no original policy idea to tackle the underlying structural challenges that keep this economy operating below potential. Meanwhile, the critical productive sectors continue to lag significantly behind, deprived of the investment needed to catalyze their growth. This, no doubt, has compounded the government inability to meet its revenue requirements. There is no way you can generate revenue from a growthless economy. You will recall during the 2025 budget debate in Parliament, we in the minority told the minister that the government's revenue policies were unrealistic, and they didn't listen to us. The data in the 2026 budget has, however, vindicated our stand. Total revenue and grants, as at the end of the third quarter reported by the minister in the budget, provisionally amounted to 154.9 billion Ghana cedis. And this is against programmed amount of 162.6 billion Ghana cedis for the same period, a shortfall of 7.7 billion Ghana cedis. Similarly, domestic revenue for quarter 1 to quarter 3 was 153.9 billion Ghana cedis against programmed 160.7 billion Ghana cedis, a shortfall of 6.8 billion Ghana cedis, whilst tax revenue for the same period stood at 124.6 billion Ghana cedis against programmed tax revenue of 133.5 billion Ghana cedis, a significant shortfall of almost 9 billion Ghana cedis. In his budget speech, the minister lost the courage to admit for once that some of his expectations were not met. Particularly, revenue generation is one of the major components of the fiscal consolidation program the government is implementing. And for its importance, the minister should have been bold to concede that all is not well with the fiscal consolidation. This is why he had to forcefully underspend in productive sectors of the economy, a practice he now calls fiscal discipline. Curiously, this year has been heavily associated with the sweeping of the accounts of various departments and agencies by the minister, including the accounts of the District Assembly's Common Fund. almost 1.4 billion Ghana cedis swept from that account, a symptom of revenue failure, a phenomenon that made many government agencies not able to function during the year. It is not a crime to accept failure when the evidence is glaring, Mr. Minister. We must also note that the 2026 revenue measures are not realistic. I hope they will listen to us this time. The government expects revenue and grants to rise to 16.8% of GDP, driven by an 18.8% increase in non-oil tax revenue. These targets rely heavily on compliance and digitalization gains that historically materialize gradually. This is not realistic. Minister, these revenue projections are not realistic. And if revenues fall in 2026, as we have seen in 2025, three outcomes are likely. New taxes will be introduced in the year, like we saw with the increase in petroleum taxes in mid-2025. Accumulation of arrears, or cuts to capital and social programs as they did in 2025 by cutting down spending on these budgeted programs. This revenue optimism may hide significant future fiscal stress, which we need to closely monitor. The minister, members of the press, also conveniently fails to mention the disastrous auction performance throughout 2025. Market participants have delivered a devastating verdict on the administration's economic management through their systematic avoidance of government securities. Out of 45 auctions conducted this year, an unprecedented 25 have failed outright, a failure rate exceeding 55%. That reveals not just market skepticism, but active rejection of government paper. Investors are voting with their feet and their capital, demonstrating a clear preference for short-term instruments over any long-term commitments to a government they no longer trust, just 10 months since they assumed office. This pattern of auction failures has created a vicious cycle. Each failed auction forces the government to rely more heavily on expensive short-term borrowing, which in turn increases rollover risk and further undermines investor confidence. The cumulative shortfalls of 17.5 billion Ghana cedis represent not just a financing gap, but a vote of no confidence in the government's ability to manage the economy sustainably. The stock market's reaction during this budget presentation week provides additional damning evidence of this confidence crisis. This week, the GSE Composite Index fell by 0.69%. In comparison, the Financial Stocks Index dropped by 0.12%, a decline that occurred precisely when the market should have been rallying on the government's supposedly positive economic news. This timing is no coincidence. It reflects sophisticated investors' assessment that the budget promises of this government lack credibility and implementation capacity. When more than half of the auctions in a single year fail, it is not the market that is broken. It is the government's credibility that has collapsed. Banks and financial institutions, traditionally the backbone of domestic financing, are increasingly reluctant to extend credit to a government that cannot honor its commitments. This credit crunch cascades through the economy, starving productive sectors of necessary capital and perpetuating the cycle of economic stagnation. Beyond this, members of the press, the Bank of Ghana's approach to currency management reveals another dimension of the government's short-term thinking. Under the IMF's program's discipline framework, foreign exchange interventions were prudently limited to a sustainable level that balanced market support with the preservation of reserves. During the MPP administration, the IMF restricted the Bank of Ghana from intervening in the forex market heavily. The intervention budget was fixed at $80 million per month, despite the international foreign reserves exceeding the IMF target. What I'm trying to say is that people have asked if it is easy to intervene, as the Bank of Ghana is intervening in the forex market, why did the MPP not do that? The reality is that the IMF restricted the Bank of Ghana from intervening heavily. they asked the Bank of Ghana to intervene only with $80 million every month. $80 million every month. Ladies and gentlemen, these restrictions were removed at the end of 2024. As a result of this, the new Bank of Ghana management and the government, when they came into office, started benefiting from the work they knew nothing about. And they began to inject massive sums of forex into the market from the reserves that were accumulated by the MPP government before we left office. At the time we left office, we accumulated almost $9 billion United States dollars. But despite these reserves, the IMF requested the Bank of Ghana to put into the market only $80 million a month. Now, what is this government doing since the restrictions were removed? They have injected several billions of dollars into the market. The last time I checked, they have injected almost $8 billion United States dollars since January into the market. Compare that with the $80 million we could only put in the market. This October and November alone, the Bank of Ghana announced they will put how much? $1.4 billion every month, isn't it? This is what they are doing. Ladies and gentlemen, despite these burdensome and costly interventions, which have reduced the cedi's value from approximately 14 Ghana cedis on 6th January 2025, when the MPP left government, to almost 11 Ghana cedis per dollar, the gains they are making from this heavy intervention are disappointingly modest and fundamentally unsustainable. With the significant billions of dollars of interventions, we expected the rate to be around 8 cedis to $1. But the market's muted response reveals a sophisticated understanding that currency strength cannot be purchased. It must be earned through sound economic fundamentals. Members of the press, did it not prick your conscience when, in touting the government management of the cedi, the minister used the exchange rate for November 2024? The exchange rate for November 2024 of 16 Ghana cedis to $1 to show the unprecedented levels of appreciation in our local currency, instead of the rate of $14 cedis to the dollar on January 6, 2025. Did it not prick your conscience? Ladies and gentlemen, this propaganda management of the economy is becoming far too much at best. Merely repeating an untruth does not make it the truth. It is important to note that this futile exercise of heavy market interventions have put stress on international reserves, while the core structural weaknesses, that is, chronically low productivity, a natural forex surrender by exporters, and anemic export performance remain completely unaddressed. Instead, these resources have been squandered on a temporary cosmetic improvement that will inevitably reverse once intervention capacity is exhausted. We only wish the government held a measured long-term view. Instead, the governor appears more interested in grabbing headlines and projecting confidence in the economy that has not undergone any significant structural change under his tenure. It was therefore not surprising that this week, the Bank of Ghana came to face the reality, in spite of our earlier warning to them that the heavy interventions were not sustainable and will hurt the economy one day. The Bank of Ghana has now issued a new framework, for the first time prepared with the IMF to guide its market intervention. For the first time, the bank has admitted that the appreciation has mainly been due to market intervention. Additionally, the Bank of Ghana has conceded that the approach to its market intervention was non-transparent and unsustainable, as it could jeopardize the reserves needed as buffer against international shocks if they continued with the huge interventions they did. whilst it promises to continue to intervene to, quote, dampen short-term volatility in the foreign exchange market, responding to disorderly conditions without undermining exchange rate flexibility. At least, it wants to do it this time in a measured and transparent manner. More importantly, the bank also concedes publicly for the first time that it has been relying on the MPP's gold purchase program, introduced by the former Vice President, Dr. Mahmoud Bawumia, under the government of President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, and is now emphatic that the gold purchase program will continue to be the anchor of its foreign exchange policy, a fact the NDC and its supporters have denied consistently. If you have not heard this yet, let me quote the Bank of Ghana from the statement it issued this week, and I quote, "The Bank of Ghana will intermediate FX flows in a market-neutral manner, using inflows from sources such as the gold purchase program or other export surrender requirements," unquote. This is what the Bank of Ghana has now admitted. Vindication, they say, is in the womb of time. But on the streets, we say, give time some time. Altogether, the government has chosen the appearance of stability over genuine economic strength. We saw this reflected in the recent negotiations with organized labor, where the government claimed victory over inflation and celebrated economic stabilization. Yet, Ghanaian workers were robbed with another token increase in the base pay by 9%. That fails to restore even a fraction of their lost purchasing power. You recall that the government increased the base pay for public workers for 2025 by 10%, a figure that was below inflation. Workers were asked to make sacrifices by His Excellency the President and promised better salaries once things improved. Workers lost real income as a result of this, because if you give them 10%, which was below inflation, they actually lost real income. We were expecting that with the much touted economic achievements announced by the minister, Ghanaian workers would have been given a decent increase in the base pay for 2026 to enable them recover the real income lost this year. Sadly, they have been insulted with an even lower increase of 9%. If you compare this with what the MPP did, you will see which party is sensitive to the plight of Ghanaians, as we increase the base pay consistently, culminating in even some 30% cumulative increase in the base pay in 2024. This is notwithstanding the fact that prices of many basic goods have not moderated. Is this an admission that a year on, they have still not improved the set conditions, which will warrant workers getting decent increase in the base pay, or an admission that they have just been deceiving organized labor? Despite moderating headline inflation, prices of many essential goods and services remain stubbornly elevated, a phenomenon economists refer to as downward price stickiness. The cost of food, utilities, transportation, and basic household necessities continue to consume an even larger share of workers' salaries, and alarmingly, there is no long-term plan to address this issue by the ruling government. Ladies and gentlemen, real fiscal discipline stands in stark contrast to the government's current approach, which involve opportunistic spending cuts and accounting manipulations. Genuine fiscal responsibility requires a comprehensive framework that balances immediate stability with long-term growth imperatives. And I have some recommendations of what reforms this government should be implementing. A program that will require full and transparent execution of Parliament-approved capital budgets, with quarterly reporting on project milestones and expenditure patterns. Comprehensive broadening of the revenue base through progressive taxation and formalization initiatives. We are not asking for increase in taxation. We are asking for the implementation of progressive taxation and formalizing initiatives which will reduce the dangerous dependence on volatile short-term financing. Strategic lengthening of domestic debt maturities to reduce rollover stress and create space for productive private sector credit. Establishment and protection of a minimum capital expenditure floor, explicitly linked to verified project milestones and development outcomes, and creation of transparent mechanisms for tracking and reporting on the economic impact of public investments, including job creation and revenue generation. These reforms will stabilize the economy on a genuinely sustainable growth path without maxing fundamental liquidity problems as prudent management. Members of the press, by systematically underspending the investment budget that Parliament approved for 2025, Ghana has made itself approximately $469 million poorer in 2025 alone, and permanently lost future growth capacity, creating an illusion of fiscal prudence built entirely on postponed progress and abandoned promise. The government has made a conscious choice to trade tomorrow's economic output for today's accounting optics, creating a growthless, jobless economy that has spectacularly failed to deliver on its core promises of transformation and prosperity to the people of Ghana. The current lower levels of inflation has rather imposed enormous strain on the people of Ghana because the government did not address inflation from the supply side. The demand side approach to inflation has ensured suppressed aggregate demand. The Bank of Ghana, for example, has admitted that as at August 2025, they had withdrawn 60 billion Ghana cedis from the market to control inflation. 60 billion Ghana cedis, the Bank of Ghana withdrew from the market just to control inflation. This obviously comes at a cost, whilst the withdrawal of liquidity dried up the pockets of Ghanaians. Farmers across the nation, from Techiman to Tamale, Ho, and many other parts of Ghana, if I don't call your town, forgive me. These farmers cannot sell their produce as demand has evaporated. Traders from Makola to Kajetia complain people are not buying their goods. In fact, let me remind traders across the country that this coming Christmas, if you don't sell to your expectation, know that it is because the NDC government has withdrawn 60 billion Ghana cedis from the market just to achieve a single-digit inflation and impoverish you. Ladies and gentlemen, Ghanaians out there should know that you are no more a matter of concern to this government, to this NDC government. They have forgotten about you after getting power from you. This is why their priority has shifted from you to using the recent helicopter accident involving some of our gallant citizens as cover to procure 2 jets, 4 helicopters, and 2 offshore patrol vessels. This is going to cost our country $1.2 billion. Government must come clear why the purchase of 2 executive jets is a priority at the time it is asking Ghanaian workers to sacrifice more. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, lower aggregate demand drives down economic growth, increased unemployment. The economy is therefore growing below its potential. In the second quarter of 2025, the economy grew by 6.3%. This was less than the 7% growth in the same period in 2024. This government is praising itself for stabilizing the economy, but real economic stability should engender economic growth. Why is this stability not generating growth? It's a matter the government must explain. How is it that when the economy has been stabilized, the government is projecting economic growth for 2026 at 4.8%, far lower than the 5.7% achieved in 2024, at the time the NDC people say the economy was recklessly managed? How come? Now, an economy that is recklessly managed could produce a growth of 5.7%. And an economy that is now said to be stabilized is projecting to grow at 4.8% in 2026. This is Kosciuszko growth. Ladies and gentlemen, another issue copiously covered in the 2026 budget was the minister's assertion that they had brought Ghana from a high debt distress to moderate due to the reduction in the national debt. What he did not state in the budget were the reasons for achieving this. With the completion of almost 93% of eligible debts restructured in 2024, including 20 billion of domestic debt, $13.1 billion in Eurobonds, and $5.1 billion in bilateral creditors' debt, Ghana was already on its way to achieving sustainable debt levels. These debt restructuring successes have further been cited by all the rating agencies, Fitch, S&P, and Moody's, as the main reason for the recent upgrades in Ghana's credit ratings. Yet the minister will not acknowledge this, conveniently. We all know that this NDC government did not undertake this restructuring work. They were all achieved under the government of President Nana Akufo-Addo. The minister has always found it difficult to acknowledge this, but this cannot be wished away. The record is there, and the record is solid. The NDC cannot even claim credit for the legislation of the Independent Fiscal Council, as well as the law capping public debt to 45% of GDP by 2034, which have been hailed as mark of fiscal reforms. The bills on these matters were submitted to Parliament as part of the IMF program requirement before the end of 2024. But the 8th Parliament came to an end without considering them. What this government did was to resubmit the same content as amendment to the Public Financial Management Act passed by Parliament this year. The claim for credit for these reforms is not surprising to us. The NDC government is characteristic of this. The renegotiation of the power contracts and the lithium agreement followed the same pattern of repackaging what the MPP did and turn around to want to take credit for them. The difference, however, is that, ladies and gentlemen, unlike the MPP, the government of the NDC is presenting these renegotiated contracts which will not inure to the benefit of Ghanaians. Why do I say that? These renegotiated contracts they are presenting seek to shorten the people of Ghana. For example, we were to save $1.5 billion when we renegotiated the power contracts and submitted the revised contracts to Parliament late last year. They are now celebrating a savings of between $200 and $300 million for renegotiating the same contracts. Similarly, in the renegotiated lithium agreement, they have reduced the royalty rate from 10% negotiated by the previous MPP government to 5%. Hey. These are two cases of poor negotiation by the NDC government. Sadly, the loud silence of civil society, which were crying above their voices when the MPP was laying the lithium agreement in Parliament with a royalty rate of 10%, make me wonder if we still have independent voices in Ghana. Not even the attempt to win the sympathy of the Ghanaian people by painting the MPP's record of the energy sector as a failure can exonerate you. Your record on the energy sector in Ghana's history is abysmal. The term Dumso is your other name and owes its existence to you because of your reckless management of the energy sector. Ghanaians cannot forget so soon. The announcement by the minister that they came to meet $1.4 billion in the energy sector owed to IPPs only shows the impressive work of the previous MPP government, as we inherited $2.4 billion when we came into office in 2017. Even the $1.4 billion the government put out was the result of the many unconscionable power contracts signed by the last NDC government, which imposed take-or-pay obligations on our country, which could not be accommodated in electricity tariffs, as some of the power plants were surplus to our capacity requirement and were most of the time idle, hence the accumulated debts. Now they want Ghanaians to clap for them for potentially making savings of $200 million from the renegotiations of the same contracts, which exposed us to several billions of dollars in bills. Mr. Minister, do you really deserve our commendation for this? Not at all. Ladies and gentlemen, what remains a mystery for us is the insincerity of this government in the way they treat the people of Ghana. You remember the VAT reforms announced in the budget and seeking to decouple NHIs and get fund levies from VAT were first presented in the 2025 budget, and which, according to the minister, was to support businesses as it will remove distortions in budget administration and lower the rates. The question we ask is, why is this repeated in the 2026 budget? Is it simply because the government didn't mean it when they put it in the 2025 budget? When this government wants to increase taxes, it does it with meteoric speed. For example, when they wanted to increase the growth and sustainability levy on the mines, they got the bill passed in March. When they wanted to extend the import levy bill to 2028, they got the bill passed. When they wanted to increase the energy sector levy on petroleum products by 1 Ghana cedis per liter of petroleum products, they got the bill passed under certificate of urgency. So if it is about raising taxes, there is urgency in passing the bills. However, when it comes to the VAT reforms to support businesses, the minister was too busy. The minister was too busy, as he failed to submit a bill for the amendment 9 months since the minister announced the reforms. This government does not believe in its own policy, particularly when it comes to the business community. We are not surprised because we all know their antecedents. They are not business friendly, even if they change their colors many times. They've destroyed businesses and continue to destroy businesses. The minister, again, in this 2026 budget statement, churn out what he thinks are superior fiscal outcomes. We will wait for the actual fiscal outcome to determine the true fiscal position for 2025 and what methodology he will use for the treatment of arrears. You recall that in the 2024 fiscal framework, which was presented by the minister in March 2025, the government prepared a shopping list of arrears, some dating back to 2022, and used it to manipulate the fiscal outcomes. Events later have vindicated us when we accuse him of data manipulation. Almost 18 billion Ghana cedis of the arrears they put in the fiscal framework for 2024 could not be validated by the Auditor General. Yet this amount was part of the so-called arrears used in determining the primary balance for 2024. What a dishonest government. We are expecting the minister to use the same methodology for determining the primary balances for 2025. What is worrying is that the IMF looked on while the minister defied the methodology for deriving the primary balance negotiated in the technical memorandum of understanding of the IMF. It is very sad that the IMF went to sleep. Members of the press, the state of the economy cannot be good, as the minister wants us to believe. It is indeed associated with empty pockets and vanishing customers, sophisticated investors actively avoiding government auctions, and ministries struggling to function as they have been starved of the basic resources needed to deliver services. The path forward demands more than cosmetic adjustment or rhetorical commitment. Ghana deserves genuine economic leadership rather than broken promises, real fiscal discipline rather than opportunistic austerity, and a government that delivers results rather than excuses. For us to move forward, we must reject the false narrative that underspending equals prudence. Proper fiscal discipline means executing approved budgets transparently and not underspending in productive sectors, but delivering precisely what was promised to the people of Ghana. In less than a year, the government policy credibility is already under threat. The 133 economy that Ghanaians were sold risks being labeled 419 if the government continues its current course. Not only the 24-hour economy, but also the promise to establish a Women Development Bank in 2025 has become another 419, which has again found space in the 2026 budget, another attempt to deceive the hard-working Ghanaian women. Only through credible policies, disciplined implementation, and transparent governance can we restore the confidence necessary to unlock Ghana's tremendous potential and deliver the prosperous future our nation deserves. The 2026 budget represented a critical test for the government to match its rhetoric with action, but the government chose to present even more half-baked policy ideas packaged as transformative initiatives. As a result, we look set to endure another year of fiscal indiscipline marked as prudence, despite the economic evidence demanding a change in approach. What we need is economic transformation, which Ghanaians were promised, but what we see now is economic stagnation masquerading as progress. It is economic decline disguised as development. And the 2026 budget does not offer the hope that could take us out of this. As we conclude, we would like to state that the structure of the 2026 budget does not support the claim of a major shift towards jobs, productivity, and transformation. Investment levels remain low, revenue projections are overly optimistic, borrowing pressures are high, key fiscal risks are under discussed, flagship programs lack transparency and costing, and budget commitment. The lower GDP base and revenue shortfalls mechanically raise the debt to GDP ratio, even if the cash deficits narrow. In effect, Ghana is consolidating by shrinking the denominator of its debt ratio. True debt sustainability requires sustained growth and credible revenue mobilization, not austerity that undermines both. Also, hidden financing pressures have not been duly reflected. The government has faced several uncovered auctions this year, and this is likely to be repeated next year. The Bank of Ghana bills remain attractive because they reflect the true interest that the market finds attractive and realistic, and these compete with the government's artificially managed bills. SOE liabilities beyond cocoa and energy that are not fully quantified. Domestic debt rollover risk, given the short-term maturities of government securities, as well as climate and disaster risks, which are not integrated into the macro-fiscal framework, pose further fiscal risk. Without addressing these risks, fiscal stability could be short-lived. Policies without clear budget risks are becoming slogans rather than deliverable programs. Ghana needs a better budget that strengthens revenue realism, expands productive investment, protects fiscal credibility, and enables the private sector to lead job creation. Members of the press, we can therefore, in conclusion, describe the 2026 budget, the Galamsey budget, as growthless, jobless, and minimalist budget. It contains only cosmetic rhetorics presented by a crawling government. The people of Ghana must speak up for the government to know that the honeymoon period is over. And we thank you very much for your attention.
It's killer budget.